The strap struck flesh in the gray morning light. She made no sound. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of breath forced out, again and again, like a chore finished before breakfast, on the ridge above Rimrock Flats. A rider reined his dark roan to a stop. The horse's ears flicked forward. The wind lay dead across the mesa. Below, in the yard of the big house with curtains drawn tight, a broad man of 50 swung a folded leather strap with patient, practiced force. The woman tied to the fence post absorbed each blow without flinching, chin lowered, dark hair veiling her face, wrists bound so tightly her hands had gone pale. Fresh stains marked the back of her worn dress. He should have kept riding. Santa Fe waited. A clean transaction. Nothing here was his to fix. But the sound had stopped him cold. He turned the horse off the road and rode toward the gate. The man in the yard looked up. Their eyes met. No shame showed there. Only the flat certainty of a man who owned everything in sight. Then the woman raised her head. The road into Rimrock Flats was the kind of road that didn't ask anything of you. Just ride through. Keep your eyes forward. Get to Santa Fe by sundown. Cord Dillard had been doing exactly that for 3 years. Riding through. Keeping his eyes forward. Not stopping for things that weren't his business anymore. He was good at it by now. The morning was still gray when he crested the low ridge above town. November cold, sitting heavy on the mesa. His horse, a dark roan he called Decker, moved slow and easy beneath him. No rush, no reason for any. Cord hadn't worn a badge in 2 years, hadn't carried a warrant or knocked on a door in an official capacity since the afternoon he'd handed his U.S. Marshal's star back across a desk in Albuquerque and walked out without saying a word. He didn't miss it. That's what he told himself, anyway. Santa Fe was waiting. A land deed transfer. A man who owed him money and had finally agreed to pay. Simple. Clean. The kind of thing that required nothing from him except showing up. He was almost past the ridge when he heard it. Not loud. That was the thing that stopped him cold. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't the kind of sound that carries across open desert and demands attention. It was smaller than that. Quieter. The kind of sound a person makes when they've learned that screaming doesn't help. A sound like breath punched out of a body. And then another. Cord pulled Decker to a stop. He sat there a moment, just listening. The wind was flat that morning. Nothing moving in the scrub, and underneath all that stillness he could hear it again. Rhythmic. Deliberate. The sound of someone hitting something that couldn't hit back. He should have kept riding. He knew that he absolutely should have kept riding. Instead, he turned Decker off the road and walked him toward the sound. The Voss property sat at the eastern edge of Rimrock Flats, like something that had been dropped there and never cleaned up. The main house was big enough, solid enough, built with money and maintained with indifference. But there was something about it. Something in the way the curtains were always drawn. In the way the yard never had flowers. In the way even the dirt around the fence posts looked beaten down. Like the earth itself had learned to keep its head low, Cord saw the woman first. She was tied to the fence post, both wrists. Rope tight enough that her hands had gone pale above the knots. Her back was against the post. Her chin was down. Dark hair loose around her face. She was wearing a dress that had been washed too many times and mended in too many places. And across the back of it, new dark stains. The man standing in front of her was maybe 50. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of broad that used to be muscle, and had turned into something harder to name. He had a leather strap folded in his right hand, and he was using it with the patience of a man doing a familiar chore. He wasn't angry. That was what turned Cord's stomach. An angry man you could reason with. An angry man was out of control. This man was in complete control. This was just his morning, just the thing he did before breakfast. He hit her again. The woman didn't cry out, didn't flinch much, just absorbed it the way a stone absorbs rain. And that quiet, practiced endurance was somehow worse than any sound she could have made. Cord walked Decker through the gate. The man didn't hear him at first, too focused on what he was doing. which meant Cord was 10 feet away before Harlan Voss looked up. Their eyes met. Harlan didn't look guilty, didn't look caught. He just looked annoyed, like someone had interrupted him in the middle of a task. "Private property," Harlan said. His voice was flat. "Certain. Road's back that way. I can see the road. Then you know where it goes." Cord didn't move. Just sat up there on Decker and looked at the woman tied to the post. Looked at her the way a man looks at something when he's trying to figure out if what he's seeing is real. She hadn't lifted her head. "Not yet." "Your daughter?" Cord asked. "My concern," Harlan said. "Not yours. That should have been the end of it." That should have been the moment. Cord touched the brim of his hat and turned Decker around and kept going toward Santa Fe. Because it wasn't his business. Because he was done making other people's messes his business. Because the last time he'd tried to fix something that wasn't his to fix, 5 people had ended up dead. And he'd ended up handing back a badge he'd spent 10 years earning. He was done with all that, except the woman raised her head, and Cord Dillard stopped breathing. He knew those eyes. He didn't know how he knew. It had been dark. It had been months ago. He'd been half dead at the time, which was not exactly ideal for forming lasting memories. But he knew those eyes. They were dark. Not the flat dark of someone beaten down, past caring, but the watchful dark of someone who had learned to observe everything, because observation was the only thing that had ever kept her alive. And they were looking at him now with something that wasn't quite recognition. More like calculation. More like this stranger on a horse was a variable she was already working out how to account for. Cord had been in the mountains east of here in February. A late-season storm, the kind that rolls in from the peaks with no warning and drops the temperature 20 degrees in an hour. Decker had shied at something in the dark, a rabbit, a shadow, nothing, and gone sideways off the trail. Cord had gone with him. Down a rocky slope he couldn't see. His head had connected with something hard on the way down. The next thing he remembered was fire, small fire. Built in a shallow cave that cut back into the cliff face. He was inside it. There was a blanket over him that wasn't his, and he was alone. But there were footprints in the thin snow outside the cave mouth, small footprints, leading away into the dark. He'd followed them for half a mile before the wind covered them over. He'd thought about those footprints more than he should have. For months he'd thought about them. Wondered who would find a half-dead stranger in a storm and drag him to shelter and build him a fire, and then just leave. No name, no explanation, nothing. He'd spent the better part of 2 months quietly asking around every trading post and encampment he came across. Nobody knew anything, or nobody said anything, which in this territory was sometimes the same thing. And now he was sitting on a horse in a stranger's yard in Rimrock Flats and looking at a pair of eyes that he was nearly certain had looked at him once before. In a cave, in a storm, when he had been absolutely useless, and she had saved his life and walked it away before he could thank her. Nearly certain. Maybe 60% certain. Enough certain to stay on the property. "I want to buy her," Cord said. Harlan Voss blinked, slowly, like a lizard. "What? Your daughter. I want to buy her contract. Whatever you've got written up, work arrangement, whatever you're calling it. Name your price." Harlan stared at him for a long time. Cord stared back. This was either going to work, or it was going to go very badly. He wasn't sure which. He also wasn't sure why he'd said it. He'd thought it would come out differently. He'd thought he might start with something more diplomatic, more measured, the careful approach he'd used for 10 years when talking to dangerous men. But those eyes, he'd just said the first thing that might actually get results. Harlan started laughing, not the warm kind. The kind that meant the other person had said something stupid. "Buy her," he said, still laughing a little. "You want to buy her?" "I do. She's not a horse." "No," Cord agreed. "Horses get treated better." The laughing stopped. There are moments in a conversation when the air changes, when something shifts that can't be shifted back. Cord had learned to feel those moments over years of standing across from men who were deciding whether to shoot him, This was one of those moments. Harlan Voss looked at him with new eyes. Not angry eyes. Thinking eyes. Which was somehow more dangerous. "Who are you?" Harlan asked. "Nobody in particular. Nobody in particular rides onto my land and makes offers for my daughter. And yet," Cord said. "Here I am." He kept his voice level. Kept his hands easy and visible. Because this was the knife-edge part. This was where it could go either way. And Cord needed it to go the right way, which meant Harlan needed to believe he was dealing with a man who had something worth having. "You're serious," Harlan said finally. Less disbelief in it now. More something else. That calculating look he'd seen in men who were always running the numbers. "About most things," Cord said. Harlan looked at the woman tied to the fence post, looked at her the way a man looks at livestock he's considering selling. And something in Cord's gut went cold and hard and stayed that way. "She's trouble," Harlan said. "Apache, stubborn, barely speaks unless she has to. You'd be getting a bad deal." Cord said nothing. Just waited. Harlan folded the leather strap in his hands. Once. Twice. "Thinking, I've got a situation," Harlan said slowly. "Most people do. Legal situation. Land matter." He paused. "There's a document. A deed transfer. Amos Aldridge signed it over to the Apache before he died. Supposed to return some grazing land to the tribe." Another pause. "That document has no business existing." Cord kept his face completely still. Because he knew about that document. He knew about it because Amos Aldridge had sent it to him. 5 years ago. 3 months before the fire. With a letter that said, "I don't trust the courts here. I don't trust anyone here except you. Keep this safe until the time is right." Amos Aldridge and his family had burned to death 2 months after writing that letter. Cord had kept the document in the inside pocket of his coat ever since. Through 2 years of active marshal work. Through the resignation, through everything after. 5 years of carrying a dead man's last careful act close to his chest. Not entirely sure why, except that it felt wrong to let it go. The fire felt wrong. The speed of it felt wrong. The way the investigation had closed so fast felt wrong, the way things feel wrong, when someone with money and influence has arranged for them to feel that way. He was starting to understand a few things very quickly. "You know about that document," Cord said. "Not a question. I know Aldridge sent something somewhere before he died," Harlan said. "I know it went to a former marshal operating out of Albuquerque. I know that man matches your description reasonably well, so Harlan had been looking, which meant Harlan knew the document existed. Which meant he'd known, all this time, that somewhere out there was a piece of paper that could take his land. "You give me that document," Harlan said, "and we'll talk about the girl." Cord looked at Nizoni. She was watching him, hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. Just watching him with those careful eyes, working out the variables. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it toward Harlan. Harlan crossed the yard, took it, unfolded it. Read it with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who has spent his life reading contracts, looking for what they give and what they take away. He folded it again, put it in his pocket. "Deal," he said. What Harlan didn't know, in approximately the 3 seconds between Harlan naming his price and Cord reaching into his coat, was that the paper in Harlan's pocket was not the original document. It was a copy. Cord had made copies. 2 of them, because he'd spent 10 years as a U.S. Marshals. And one of the first things you learned was that original documents had a way of disappearing when inconvenient people got hold of them. The original was in a sealed envelope, addressed to the territorial judge in Santa Fe, in a saddlebag on Decker's left flank, with a cover letter explaining everything. That letter had been written 5 years ago, 3 months before the fire took everything. Waiting for the moment when Cord finally figured out what he was waiting for. He was starting to think this might be it. Harlan reached for Nizoni's wrists, and then he stopped, turned around to face Cord, who was still on the horse. "One thing," Harlan said. His voice had changed, gotten quieter. The businesslike tone was still there, but underneath it, something else had started moving. something that had nothing to do with documents or deals. I need a moment with my daughter. Say goodbye properly. Cord looked at him. Won't take long, Harlan said. Man's entitled to say goodbye to his own child. Everything in Cord said no. Everything in him heard the word goodbye and understood exactly what kind of goodbye Harlan Voss meant to say. The kind that left marks, the kind designed to follow a person, to remind them, every time they moved wrong, every time they breathed wrong, that they were still owned. Even when they were gone. Step back, Cord said quietly. Harlan tilted his head. Beg your pardon, step back. She's still mine until I untie those ropes. No, Cord said. The deal's made. That means she's already not yours. Harlan looked at him for a long moment, that calculating look again. Measuring distance. Measuring the angle of Cord's right hand to his hip. Measuring all the variables of whether this was a fight he wanted to have in front of witnesses. Because there were none. They were alone in this yard, or a fight he wanted to have in some other way, at some other time. He stepped back. It was not a retreat. It was a postponement, and Cord knew the difference. Cord dismounted, walked to the fence post, took out his pocket knife and cut the rope at Nizoni's wrists. The knots would have taken too long, and he wanted her free fast. When the ropes fell away, her hands dropped to her sides. She didn't reach for him, didn't grab the post for balance, though she needed to. She just stood there with her hands at her sides, and her chin level and her eyes on Harlan's back. Not on Cord, on Harlan, even now. Even freed. Even with a stranger cutting her loose. She was watching the threat, because the threat was what she knew. The threat was predictable. Safe to watch. A stranger helping her was something she had no category for yet. Can you ride? Cord asked her quietly. She didn't answer. I've got a horse. You can ride behind me or I can get you onto Decker's, back alone if you'd rather. But we need to leave now. Still nothing. Cord didn't push it, just turned and walked Decker toward the gate. Moving slow, not grabbing, not pulling, just going and trusting that she'd follow. She did. He didn't look back to check, but he felt her walking behind him. Heard the soft sound of her feet on the hard dirt. When they reached the gate, he stopped Decker and offered her his hand. She looked at his hand for a long time. He kept it there, patient, not moving. Then she took it and let him help her up behind him. Her hands rested on his sides, barely touching, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Like she'd spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. Cord looked back once. Harlan Voss was standing at the edge of his porch, arms at his sides, watching them go, and he was smiling. Not the laughing smile from before. Something smaller. Something that already knew. Something that Cord didn't know yet. That smile stayed with Cord for a long time after they were down the road. Dessa Running Water found them before Cord had decided where to go. That was how it felt. Anyway, like she'd been waiting at the bend in the road east of town, sitting on a low stone with her hands in her lap and her eyes already on Nizoni before their horse had even come into view. She was older, 60 maybe, small and square-shouldered, with gray streaked through her black hair, and hands that looked like they'd been used hard for most of those 60 years. She wore a plain cotton dress and a blanket around her shoulders, and she looked at Cord with the look of a person who has survived long enough to develop an excellent sense of which white men were worth trusting, and which were not, and was still in the process of deciding where he landed. She said something in Apache, quick and soft, to Nizoni, not to him. Nizoni made a small sound, something between a word and a breath. Dessa's face changed, not much, but enough. She stood up, came to the horse, reached up and touched Nizoni's face with one full hand, looked at the bruising, looked at the rope marks on her wrists, made a sound under her breath that was not a word in any language Cord knew, but that was absolutely clear in its meaning. Then she looked at Cord. You took her from Harlan Voss, she said. Her English was precise, careful. I did, he let you. We made a deal. Harlan Voss doesn't make deals, she said. He makes traps. Cord said nothing, because she wasn't wrong and he knew it. Dessa looked at him a moment longer. Then she appeared to make some decision and looked back at Nizoni. "Come down," she said gently. "Come." Nizoni slid off the horse without any help. She was steadier than Cord expected, or maybe not steadier. Maybe just accustomed to moving through pain. Maybe her body had learned to do what it needed to do, regardless of what it was feeling, because that was what 20 years of survival had required. Dessa put her arm around Nizoni's shoulders and said something quietly. Nizoni didn't answer, but she leaned into it slightly. Just slightly. Like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be held and was relearning the concept cautiously. "She'll come with me," Dessa told Cord. "My people have a camp east of here. She can rest, heal." "All right," Cord said. Dessa looked at him again, deciding something. "And you?" "I've got some things to figure out," Cord said. "In Rimrock Flats." "In Rimrock Flats. You should leave," she said, flatly. Not unkindly, just as fact. "Harlan Voss has a long memory and a short temper, and everyone in this town is afraid of him, I know," Cord said. And yet he agreed. Dessa looked at him for another long moment. Then she made that decision again, whatever it was. And she turned and started walking east with her arm around Nizoni. Cord watched them go. Nizoni didn't look back. He hadn't expected her to, but he noticed it anyway. Rimrock Flats had one saloon, one dry goods store, one church that looked like it was losing the argument with gravity, and a sheriff's office that sat in the middle of Main Street like it owned the place, which technically it did, except that everyone in town seemed to understand that the building belonged to the law, but the law belonged to Harlan Voss, which was a different thing entirely. Cord came to understand this over the next 3 hours. Specifically, he came to understand it by walking into the dry goods store and asking, with studied casualness, about the fire. "What fire?" said the man behind the counter, whose name was Peters and whose eyes went somewhere else the moment Cord asked the question. "The Aldridge place," Cord said. 5 years back. "The one where the family died. Terrible thing," Peters said, already rearranging items on the shelf behind him that didn't need rearranging. "Sheriff investigated thoroughly?" "Sure he did. Lamp fire," they said. "Can happen to anyone." Cord said. Peters put down the jar he was holding, turned around, looked at Cord with the expression of a man who wants to say something and has also spent 5 years learning not to. "You're the man who took Voss's girl this morning." "News travels. In Rimrock Flats it does." Peters lowered his voice. "You should know. Last man who asked about the Aldridge fire left town the following week. Under his own power, I'll say that. But he left. What was he asking about?" "Same as you, I expect." Peters looked at the door, Cord. "The kerosene." Cord, his face neutral. "What kerosene?" Peters pressed his lips together, shook his head, went back to rearranging his shelf. "You want to buy something or not?" Cord bought a bag of oats for Decker and left. He found a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Callister, who ran it, looked at him like she was hoping he'd decide not to stay. He paid for a week in advance, which persuaded her into something that wasn't quite welcome, but was at least tolerance. The room was small, one window overlooking the alley. A bed that had seen better decades. Cord sat on the edge of it and thought about the smile on Harlan Voss's face when they rode out of his yard. Dessa's word kept circling back. Trap. Because Harlan had been too calm about the document. A man who'd spent years worried about that land deed, years quietly searching for it. And when the moment came, he just pocketed the paper and said deal without any of the relief that should have accompanied it. Without any sense of a problem being solved, which meant either Harlan suspected the document wasn't genuine, or Harlan had something else in motion that made the document not matter, or both. Cord pulled out his pocket knife and turned it over in his hands. Old habit, something to do with his hands when his brain was working. He thought about the kerosene. He thought about Amos Aldridge's letter. "I don't trust anyone here except you." He thought about a family of 5. A father and mother and 2 young children. He'd heard there were children, Clara and Thomas. He'd been told their names once in passing, and they'd stayed with him, and they'd all died in a fire that the sheriff of Rimrock Flats had closed as accidental inside a week. He thought about how that was very fast. He thought about how fires involving kerosene burned hot and fast and looked deliberate to anyone who knew what to look for. He thought about Sheriff Burl Pickett, whose office he'd walked past twice this afternoon without stopping, watching the man through the window both times. Pickett was maybe 45, heavyset, the kind of lawman who'd gotten the job because nobody else wanted it, and then discovered that the person who wanted it least was now running it. He'd been staring at paperwork both times Cord walked past, but his pen hadn't been moving. A man staring at paper and not writing anything is a man thinking about something else. Cord was going to have a conversation with Sheriff Pickett. Just not today. Today he needed Pickett to know nothing about him, except that he'd taken Nizoni from Harlan's property on a business transaction. Nothing suspicious, nothing official. He also needed to find Cutter Briggs. He'd heard the name once, 2 years back, when he'd been quietly asking questions about the Aldridge fire from a safe distance. A writer passing through Albuquerque who'd grown up in Rimrock Flats. He'd mentioned Cutter Briggs almost by accident, used to work for Harlan Voss. Rode out the day after the fire, never came back. Then the writer had seemed to realize he'd said too much and changed the subject. A man who rides out the day after 5 people die and never returns is either terrified or guilty or both. Cord needed to find out which, but first, things first. He put his knife away, stood up, looked out the window at the alley, at the flat gray sky beginning to darken toward evening, at the dust that sat on everything in this town like it had decided to stay. He thought about 2 small footprints in snow, leading away from a cave, into a storm. He thought about a woman who could find a stranger dying in the dark and save his life and ask nothing. Keep nothing, not even recognition. He thought about what it took to be that quiet about your own goodness. He thought about how long she'd been living in that house. 20 years. 20 years in Harlan Voss's house, and she'd still managed to be the kind of person who stopped in a blizzard for a stranger. He didn't have to do anything with that. It wasn't his business what kind of person she was. He'd gotten her away from Harlan, and that was the thing he needed to do, and it was done. Dessa had her now. She'd be safe. She'd heal. Whatever came next was for her to decide, without any input from a former marshal, with a complicated past and no particular place to be. That was the sensible thing. That was the clean thing. Cord looked at the alley for another minute. Then he went downstairs and asked Mrs. Callister if he could get dinner. The next morning, Cord rode out east. He told himself it was to check on Decker. Decker was fine. He told himself it was to think through the Briggs situation with fresh air and open land around him. That was partially true. He told himself it had nothing to do with the camp east of town, where Dessa Runningwater was looking after a 20-year-old woman who had never done anything to deserve the life she'd been handed. He told himself a lot of things on that ride. The camp was small. 4 or 5 structures, a central fire, horses in a simple rope enclosure, the kind of temporary winter camp that moved with the season. There were women working at the fire, and a few men at the edges, with the careful, alert posture of people who had learned to watch everything. Dessa appeared before he'd gotten within 50 yards. She didn't wave him in, just waited. Cord pulled up and waited too. They looked at each other. For a moment. She's sleeping, Dessa said finally. She slept 14 hours. She needed it. Good, Cord said. She hasn't eaten much. Takes time. Dessa tilted her head at him. You didn't come to ask about her health. I came to see if there was anything she needed. Why? Cord thought about how to answer that. Settled on honest. Because I owe her. Dessa's expression shifted slightly. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. For what? February. Sangre Altapas. I was in a bad situation in a storm. Dessa looked at him for a long time. She didn't tell me about that. She wouldn't. Another long look. Then Dessa stepped aside in a way that meant he could dismount. He did. She didn't bring him into the camp. just stood with him at the edge of it, in the way of a woman who trusts her own judgment but isn't finished forming it yet. "She can't go back to that house," Cord said. "I know." "Harlan's going to want to." "I know," Dessa said again. "Creeter. I know what Harlan Voss wants, and I know what he does to get it. I've known this man for 20 years. Since before Nizoni's mother died." She paused on that word. Died. Like it had a different meaning than its ordinary one. "He won't come out here. Not yet. He'll use the town first. Use the sheriff. Use the talk. He's already starting," Cord said. "Peters at the store mentioned I should be careful. Peters is a nervous man. Most of the town seems nervous." "Yes," Dessa said simply. "That's what Harlan Voss does. Makes a whole town nervous and then sells them the feeling that only he can make it stop." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find Cutter Briggs." Something moved in Dessa's face. "Quick. There and gone. You know that name," Cord said. "I know that name," she said. "What can you tell me?" Dessa folded her hands in front of her. A gesture of deciding. "He was there," she said quietly, "the night the Aldridge family died. Nizhny's mother told me. She heard Harlan coming in late that night. She heard 2 horses, not 1. She smelled smoke on his coat." She paused. "She told me this the week before she died. She was afraid. What did she die of?" Dessa looked at him with steady eyes. "What the doctor called fever," she said. Cord said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would make any difference. He looked out at the camp. The fire. The women moving with their quiet purposes. The wide flat sky above the mesa, pale and cold and full of nothing. "She should know," he said. "Nizoni. She should know what's happening and what I'm doing. She should be able to make her own decisions. She's sleeping. When she's not." Dessa studied him. "Why?" "Because she's the one this is about," Cord said. "Not me. Not Harlan. Not some land deed. Her." He paused. "She should be the one who decides what happens next." Dessa was quiet for a long time. "Come back tomorrow," she said finally. "In the afternoon. She'll be awake by then." Cord nodded. Turned back toward Decker. "Marshal," Dessa said behind him. He looked back. "Former," he said. "Former," she agreed. A pause. "Thank you." For stopping, Cord turned back to his horse. Swung up, started the slow ride back toward Rimrock Flats and its nervous people and its nervous sheriff, and whatever was waiting in the days ahead. He thought about the way Harlan had smiled when they rode out. He thought about Dessa's word. Trap. Footprints in snow, leading away. Into the dark. He rode into town with the cold coming down off the mesa, and the sun going flat and orange and the street quiet, except for the wind that moved through Rimrock Flats, like it was looking for something it had lost. Somewhere behind him, east of town, a young woman was sleeping, for the first time without fear. Somewhere ahead of him, a man named Harlan Voss was sitting in a big house with the curtains drawn and thinking about his next move. And somewhere in a mining camp 120 miles north, a man who went by a name he hadn't been born with was drinking himself into his usual evening, trying not to hear things that had happened 5 years ago. Cord Dillard rode back to his room at Mrs. Callister's. He was not going to Santa Fe, not yet. He had unfinished business in Rimrock Flats, New Mexico territory. And he had the particulars palms. And he had the particular feeling, the one he'd learned over 10 years to trust even when he couldn't explain it, that the next few days were going to require every careful, patient, deliberate skill he'd spent a decade acquiring and then spent 2 years trying to forget. He tied Decker up out front, went inside, ate whatever Mrs. Callister had left warming on the stove, sat by the window in the dark, thought about a woman who could save someone's life and ask nothing in return, thought about a family named Aldridge, Clara, Thomas, thought about fire, and waited for morning. 5 days after leaving Harlan Voss's yard, Nizoni said her first word to Cord Dillard. Not a sentence, not an explanation, just a word. He'd come to the camp every afternoon like Dessa's, sat outside the perimeter, not pushing, not asking, just being a presence that didn't demand anything, which was apparently a new concept in her life, because she spent the first 3 days watching him, from a distance the way a hawk watches, something it hasn't decided about yet. Day 4, she sat closer, still outside, still not talking. But closer day 5, she walked up to where he was sitting on a flat rock and stood next to him and looked out at the mesa and said, "Why?" Not a question, the way most people ask questions. More like a word she'd been turning over for 5 days and had finally decided to put down somewhere. Cord thought about it. "Because you stopped," he said, "in the storm. You didn't have to." She was quiet for a long time. "Neither did you," she said. And that was that. That was the whole conversation. She went back inside. Cord rode back to town. But that night he sat in his room at Mrs. Callister's and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. He went back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. Dessa watched all of this with the expression of a woman who has seen everything and is reserving comment. She brought them tea sometimes, left it, and went away, which Cord suspected was her version of encouragement. Although with Dessa you were never entirely sure, Nozomi started talking more. Slowly, in pieces. Not about herself, not yet, but about things around her. The way the light came off the mesa in the early morning. The name of a hawk she'd been watching for 3 days. The difference between 2 types of desert plant that looked identical to Cord, but that she could apparently distinguish by smell. She was teaching him things, he realized. Not formally. Not as a lesson. Just sharing what she knew. The way you do with someone when you're starting to think they might be worth sharing things with. He told her about Santa Fe. About the land deed in his saddlebag. About Amos Aldridge. She went very still when he said that name. "I knew him," she said. "I know. He was kind." She said it simply. Like kindness was a rare enough thing that it needed to be noted when you encountered it. He used to leave extra grain for the horses when we traded. More than agreed. Never said anything about it. Cord nodded. That sounded like Amos. "He's been dead 5 years, Nozomi said. "Yes," she looked at him. "You've been carrying his document for 5 years. "Yes, why?" "Because it felt wrong," Cord said. "The fire. The way the sheriff closed it so fast. I couldn't prove anything, and I couldn't stay, but I couldn't let go of it either." She was quiet for a moment. Looking out at the mesa, at the afternoon light coming flat and cool across the red rock. And then she said, "I was there. It came out pieces, not all at once. That's not how things like this come out. They come out the way water comes through cracked stone. Slow, following the fractures. Finding the way through a little at a time, because the whole thing at once would break something that can't be repaired." She'd been 15. Harlan had woken her in the middle of the night, told her to get dressed, told her they were going for a ride. She hadn't questioned it. You didn't question Harlan. You just did what he said, and tried to make yourself small enough that his attention passed over you. He'd driven the wagon himself, 2 barrels in the back. She'd smelled the kerosene from the moment she climbed up, hadn't understood what it meant. Not then. They'd gone to the Aldridge property. Cord kept his face very still while she talked. This was the discipline of 10 years. The ability to listen to terrible things without letting his reaction interrupt the telling. Because sometimes the telling was the most important thing. Sometimes the person who'd been carrying a weight needed to put it down more than they needed anything else you could give them. Harlan had made her stay on the wagon. He'd taken the barrels. She'd watched him move around the property in the dark. Quiet and certain, the way he always was when he'd made a decision. There was a light in the house. Someone awake. And then Harlan had gone to the door and knocked. She'd heard voices. Amos Aldridge's voice. Surprised. Then cooperative. The way you get when someone you half trust shows up unexpectedly, and you're trying to be polite about it. They'd gone to the barn. All of them. Including the children. Cheered the children because Clara had been asking her father something. A sleepy question. The voice of a child who'd been woken up and was still confused about it. Clara was 7. Thomas was 4. Nozomi said their names carefully. Like she'd been saying them inside her head for 5 years just to make sure she didn't forget. Cord said nothing. She told him about the doors. She told him about the fire starting at the base of the barn. Fast, the way things burn when they're helped. She told him about the sounds. She didn't describe them further than that, just said, the sounds. And Cord understood, and was grateful she didn't describe them further, because some things, once described in detail, can't be undescribed, and they live in the listener forever after Harlan had driven them home. Calm, both hands on the reins. He hadn't looked at her the whole way back, not until they pulled into the yard. And then he turned and looked at her with that flat measuring gaze of his and said, "Now you know what happens to people who have things I need." She'd been 15 years old. She'd kept that sentence inside her for 5 years. Cord sat with the weight of it, let it settle, let it be what it was without trying to immediately fix it, or turn it into something actionable, because that was what you did with information, in his line of work, and this wasn't information. This was a human being telling him something that had been destroying her quietly for 5 years, and she deserved more than someone turning it into a case file. "Dessa's right," Nizoni said finally, her voice completely steady. "I should have spoken sooner." "Those children? You were 15, Cord said, "and you just watched what he was capable of. You did what you had to do to survive. People keep dying while I survive." That landed hard. He didn't pretend it didn't. "Yes," he said, "because she deserved honesty more than comfort." "That's true. And I'm sorry." A pause. "The way to stop more people dying is to make sure Harlan can't do it again. That's what I'm working on." She looked at him sideways. "By yourself, mostly." A silence. "You'll need more than yourself," she said. "I know. What do you have?" "The document. Yurta and a name." Cutter Briggs. Something crossed her face. Quick. A recognition. And behind it something harder. "He was there," she said. "He drove the second wagon. He's alive. I'm going to find him." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I want to help." "You are helping." "What you just told me." "No." She turned to look at him directly. Full attention. The kind that didn't leave room for pretending. "I mean, I want to help. Not tell my story to someone who goes and acts on it. I want to be part of what happens next." A pause. "This is my life. Those were my years. I want to be there when it ends." Cord looked at her for a long moment. He thought about 15 different reasons that was complicated. The danger, the exposure, the risk. He thought about Dessa's words. "She should be the one who decides." "All right," he said. She nodded, once. Like they'd just agreed on something practical and straightforward, which they had, but also hadn't. The mining camp at Copper Ridge sat 120 miles north of Rimrock Flats. Far enough that Harlan wouldn't think to look there. Close enough that a man on a good horse could make it in 3 days each way if he pushed. Cord gave himself 8 days. 5 to get there, talk, and start back. 3 for whatever went wrong. Because something always went wrong. He left Dessa with a pass on if he didn't return. The message went to the territorial judge in Santa Fe. It was very specific about who to look at if Cord turned up dead. Copper Ridge was not a pleasant place. Most mining camps weren't. They were functional, which was different from pleasant. Rows of rough wooden structures. Mud in the streets from the water they used in the sluices. Men who looked like they'd left their previous lives somewhere behind them, and weren't entirely sure they wanted them back. He asked about Reuben Falk at the camp office, and the man behind the desk gave him the look that meant, "None of my business, and I'd like it to stay that way." But he pointed toward the far end of the camp. Cord found Cutter Briggs in a small structure, at the edge of the operation. He was shoeing a horse with the focused attention of a man who preferred tasks that required looking down. He was maybe 40, hard-used 40. The kind that happened when you spent years doing things you couldn't make peace with. His hands were steady on the work, but there was a tension in his shoulders that didn't relax even when he was bending over a hoof. Cord tied Decker and stood outside the structure, waited. Cutter Briggs eventually looked up, and then went very still. He hadn't been expecting this, but he also, Cord could see, wasn't entirely surprised. The way a man isn't surprised when something he's been expecting for years finally shows up. "You're not from the camp," Cutter said. "No, you're not buying horses." "No." Cutter set down his tools, stood up slowly. He was bigger than Cord had expected. But there was nothing threatening in how he stood. Just exhausted. Profoundly and completely exhausted in the way that had nothing to do with the day's work. "I know why you're here," Cutter said. "Then I'll save us both the time," Cord said. "I need you to come back to Rimrock Flats. I need you to testify to what happened the night the Aldridge family died." Silence. Cutter looked at the horse, back at Cord. Then at something middle distance that had nothing to do with either of them. "I hear them," he said. "The children." Every night, he stopped. Clara had a red ribbon in her hair. "I don't know why I remember that." "I remember it every time." Cord didn't say anything. "I thought he was going to threaten them," Cutter said. "That's what I told myself." Harlan said it was going to be a conversation. Scare them into giving him more time on the debt. "I didn't." He stopped, jaw tight. "When he put the bar across the door, I tried to stop him. He put a gun in my face and told me I was as guilty as he was now. That if I said a word, I'd hang. Alongside him, he was right that you'd be implicated." Cord said, not unkindly. "But the law makes a distinction between someone who lights a fire and someone who was present and coerced. That distinction matters. A judge will hear it." Cutter looked at him. "What if the judge is in Harlan's pocket?" "He's not," Cord said. "Not the territorial judge. Harlan owns the local circuit. He doesn't own Santa Fe." Cutter was quiet for a long time. "If I come back," he said slowly, "and it doesn't work. If Harlan gets out of this..." "I'm not going to let Harlan get out of this." "You sound very sure of that." "I am." "Why?" Cord thought about the document in his saddle bag. About Nizzoni saying Clara was 7, Thomas was 4. About 2 small footprints in snow leading away into a blizzard. "Because too many people have stayed quiet for too long," he said. "And I'm tired of being the outcome." Cutter looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the horse, the tools on the ground, the small structure he'd been hiding in for 5 years under a name that wasn't his. "I'll need 2 days," he said. "Take them," Cord said. "I'll be at the North Camp entrance on the 3rd morning. We ride before anyone notices you're gone." He was on his way back to Rimrock Flats. One day into the return ride, when they hit him, 3 of them, well-positioned. They'd picked a stretch of canyon where the walls narrowed, and the only way through was a trail barely wide enough for a horse. Smart. Whoever Harlan had hired, they weren't stupid. The first shot took his hat off, which was how he knew they weren't trying to kill him immediately. Warning shot. Slow him down. Which meant they wanted to talk first, or they wanted to confirm who he was before finishing it. Either way, the slight delay was the only reason he was able to pull Decker hard right into a side channel that he almost certainly wouldn't have seen in time, except that his eyes had been moving constantly since he left Copper Ridge because he'd spent 10 years as a marshal. And some things you don't unlearn. The next 20 minutes were not something he wanted to think about in detail afterward. He got out of the canyon, that was the main thing. He got out of the canyon and got Decker into open country, and the 3 riders behind him were fast. But Decker was faster on open ground, and he knew the terrain between here and Rimrock Flats better than hired guns from wherever Harlan had brought them from. He lost them before sundown, but his right arm, the upper part, had connected with a rock during the scramble in the canyon, and something in it was wrong. Not broken. He'd broken bones before and knew what that felt like. But wrong in the way of something pulled or torn that was going to make the next several days significantly more inconvenient than planned. He wrapped it himself at a creek stop. Not well. Well enough. He rode back into Rimrock Flats in the dark, went directly to Mrs. Callister's stable, saw to Decker, and went to bed without eating. In the morning, the arm was worse. He went to see Dessa. She looked at his arm with the expression of a woman who has treated injuries before and finds this particular one annoying for reasons that go beyond the medical. "You went north alone," she said. "I found him, And he'll testify. And someone tried to stop you from coming back. 3 someones. Dessa made a sound. She was rewrapping his arm with competence that suggested she'd done this kind of work many times and did not particularly enjoy it. Harlan knows you went to find Briggs. Seems that way, which means he knows what you're building, or suspects. Harlan doesn't guess, Dessa said. He doesn't act on guesses. If he sent 3 men, he knows. She tied off the wrap, looked at him. He'll move faster now, so will I. Dessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and said, Nozomi wants to talk to you. He followed her to where Nozomi was. Sitting near the fire, she looked different than she had when he'd left. More settled. Not happy exactly, not that simple, but something in her face had resolved in the days he'd been gone. Like a decision had been made that couldn't be unmade. She looked at his arm. You're hurt. I'm manageable. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him with that direct, calculating gaze, reading him. Reading the whole situation with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years reading threats and cataloging them. He sent men after you. Yes, because he's scared. Yes, she nodded, slow, like she was confirming something she'd already worked out. I want to tell you something else. Cord waited. 2 nights before you came to the yard, she said. Harlan came to me. Not to hit me, just to talk. He does that sometimes. Talks at me. I think it's because there's no one else who has to listen. A pause. He said the lawyer in Santa Fe was getting curious again. About the Aldridge land. He said he needed the document before the end of the month, or there would be complications. She looked at Cord. He knew you were coming. Cord sat with that. He hadn't told anyone where he was going or when. He'd written 1 letter, sealed, to the territorial judge, saying he intended to look into the Aldridge case when the time was right. That letter was several months old. Did he say how he knew? He said he had someone in Santa Fe who told him things. She paused. He was in a good mood when he said it. That's when he's most dangerous. When he's pleased with himself. Cord was quiet for a moment. So Harlan had informants in Santa Fe, which meant the document alone wasn't going to be enough. Which meant even if they went to the territorial judge, Harlan would know about it before it could be acted on. Which meant they needed to take this somewhere Harlan couldn't intercept it. They needed to take it public. He went to see Sheriff Pickett that afternoon. This was partly calculation, and partly something else. Because the shape of this situation had been bothering him since Peters mentioned the kerosene, and the shape of it included a sheriff who'd been to that fire scene first and closed the investigation in 4 days. Cord needed to understand whether Burl Pickett was a man who was evil or a man who was trapped. It mattered, not to the outcome necessarily, but it mattered to him. The sheriff's office smelled like old coffee and old paper, and the staleness of a room where decisions were made that nobody was proud of. Pickett was at his desk. He looked up when Cord came in, and his face did the thing Cord had been watching for, the slight freeze, the recalculation. He knew exactly who Cord was. Mr. Dillard, Pickett said. Careful. Like a man picking his way across a floor he wasn't sure about. Sheriff. Cord sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited. I'd like to talk about the Aldridge fire. Pickett's hands went flat on his desk. That case is closed, I know. Accidental. Lamp fire, I know that's what you wrote. Cord looked at him steadily. I'm wondering if that's what you saw. Long silence. Pickett looked at the door, at the window, at his own hands. All the places that weren't Cord. You should be careful, Pickett said finally low, almost a murmur. You're a stranger in this town. Stranger making accusations about respected people tends to. I'm not making accusations, Cord said. I'm asking a man I think might be tired of being careful what he actually saw. The night 5 people died. Something moved in Pickett's face. Complicated. The way a man's face moves when he's been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and someone has just acknowledged the weight. I can't, Pickett said. Can't or won't. A long pause. He said, very quiet. Cord looked at him. Really looked. the set of his shoulders, the darkness under his eyes that wasn't just tiredness, the way his hands pressed flat on the desk like he was trying to keep something down. "He has something on you," Cord said. Pickett said nothing. "Whatever it is," Cord said, "it's kept you here for 5 years doing a job that's become something else entirely. Something you didn't sign on for." A pause. "You're not sleeping much." Pickett looked up at him sharply. "It's a guess," Cord said, "based on what your face looks like." Pickett looked back at his hands. "What do you want from me, right now?" "Nothing," Cord stood. "But when the time comes, and it's coming soon, I need to know which way you'll fall." "The time comes," Pickett said slowly. "I'll do what I have to do." "That's not the same as what's right." Pickett said nothing. Cord picked up his hat. "I'll be in touch, Sheriff." He walked out into the cold afternoon and didn't look back. He had what he came for. Not a commitment, not anything he could use yet. But the picture of Sheriff Burl Pickett was clear now, not evil. Trapped. The question was whether a trapped man could choose to stop being trapped. Whether the choice to do right was still available to someone who'd been making wrong choices for 5 years. Cord had seen it go both ways. 3 days after that, Harlan Voss started talking. Cord heard it first from Mrs. Callister, who heard it from the woman who ran the laundry, who heard it from 3 separate people who'd heard it from Harlan directly. The stories were different in their details but identical in their shape. Nizoni was dangerous, unstable, hinta, prone to violence, to lion kind of madness that sometimes came in mixed blood. She'd attacked Harlan multiple times. He'd kept her close for her own safety and the safety of the community. But now she'd run off with a stranger and was filling this stranger's head with delusions about fires and crimes, and God knows what other fantasies. Cord was an ex-marshal, fired for corruption. A man who'd take any case for money, being paid by Apache agitators to stir up land claims. Hessessa, Running Water was harboring a dangerous fugitive. The stories kept coming. Cord collected them the way you collect evidence, noticing what they all had in common, noticing what they were designed to prevent. Because Harlan wasn't just protecting himself. He was building a wall. Every person who heard these stories and believed them was another brick. And by the time Cord tried to bring Nizoni's testimony to light, she'd be walking into a room full of people who already believed she was a liar. He needed to get ahead of it. He spent an evening writing letters to the territorial judge, detailed and specific, to 2 former colleagues from his marshal years who'd moved to Santa Fe and were the kind of men who still cared about things being right, to a woman named Elsa Brand who ran a newspaper in Albuquerque and had published 3 investigations into land fraud in the past decade. Not asking for help yet, just setting things in motion, creating a record. When things happened in Rimrock Flats, someone outside of Rimrock Flats would know why Cutter Briggs rode into the Apache camp on the 3rd morning. Like he said he would, he looked terrible, which was appropriate. A man riding back to the place where his worst decision happened was not going to look his best. Nizoni was standing at the edge of the camp when he arrived. She'd known he was coming. Cord had told her. Cutter saw her and stopped his horse. The 2 of them looked at each other. And the weight of that look, what each of them knew, what each of them had carried, filled the space between them so fully that Cord took a step back just to be outside of it. "I'm sorry," Cutter said, not to Cord. To her, she looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, just acknowledgement. The 2 of them had shared something terrible, and there was nothing to do with that except stand in it for a moment before moving forward. It was Dessa who broke the silence. She came out with 2 cups of something hot and distributed them, without comment, and went back inside, which was her way of marking the end of the moment and the beginning of the practical. They sat together, Cord, Nizoni, Cutter, Dessa at the edge, and they talked through what Cutter had seen, what he'd done, what he could testify to. Cord asked questions with the careful precision of a man building a structure that had to hold weight. Cutter answered them with the ragged thoroughness of someone emptying a long-sealed room. He'd been there. He'd spread the kerosene, while Harlan led the Aldridge family to the barn, under the pretext of showing them a sick animal. He'd heard the bar go across the doors. He'd tried to stop it. Harlan had put a gun in his face and spoken very clearly about what would happen if he interfered. He'd run the next morning, changed his name, found work as far from Rimrock Flats as he could get, while still being on the same territory. "You can testify to all of this," Cord said. "Yes. You understand what that means for you legally?" "Yes." A pause. "I'm guilty of something. I know that. I was there. I helped." His voice went flat. "I'd rather hang for it than spend another 5 years hearing those children." "You won't hang," Cord said. "What I can promise is that you'll face something. A lesser charge. Cooperation goes a long way." "I don't care about the charge," Cutter said. "I care about saying it out loud, in public. To people who can hear it." Cord nodded. Nizoni had been quiet through all of this, listening carefully. When Cutter finished, she said, "Will it be enough? Your testimony." "His testimony." "The physical evidence I recovered." Cord looked at her. "It should be. In a court that isn't inside Harlan's reach." "A public hearing isn't a court," she said. "No, but a public hearing is something Harlan can't manage the way he manages everything else. He can manage judges. He can manage sheriffs. He can't manage 200 people hearing the same thing at the same time." He paused. "After a public hearing, the territorial court has no choice. Not with witnesses, not with documentation, not with a man willing to testify that he was there." She thought about this. "He'll try to stop us. Before we get to the hearing." "Yes, he already tried to stop you." "Yes." She looked at his arm. "And you're proposing to do this with one working arm." "I'm improving. It isn't." "It will." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out at the mesa, at the cold, clear afternoon sky, at the red rock going orange in the lowering sun. "I want to be there," she said, "at the hearing. I want to be the one who stands up and says what he did." "You will be," Cord said. "And I want to say it to his face," she said, "not to the crowd." To him, Cord looked at her. He thought about what it meant to want that. Not revenge. Something cleaner. Something about reclaiming the thing Harlan had been taking for 20 years. The right to exist without being afraid of him. The right to look at him directly. "All right," he said. She nodded. They sat for a while longer as the sun went down over Rimrock Flats. The fire crackled between them. Dessa brought food, and no one said no. And somewhere in the ordinary act of eating together, while the dark came in, something shifted. They were not just people with a shared problem anymore. Dessa found Cord before he left that evening, caught him at Decker's side, and said, with no preamble, "She hasn't slept more than a few hours at a stretch since she got here, I know," he said. "She won't let anyone see it bother her. I know that too." Dessa looked at him in the last of the light. Something had changed in how she looked at him over the past week. Less assessment, more something else. "She's been asking about you," she said. "When you were gone north." Cord kept his hands busy with Decker's saddle. "Asking what?" "Whether you'd come back." A pause. "She asked once an evening." Tried to make it sound casual. Dessa's voice had a dryness in it that was as close to humor as she generally got. "She's not entirely convincing." Cord said nothing. "You should know," Dessa said. "She's never asked that about anyone. In the entire time I've known her." He looked up. Dessa met his eyes, held them, then looked back toward the camp. "Don't give her a reason to stop." He rode back to Rimrock Flats, in the dark thinking about that. About a woman who had survived 20 years of a man telling her she was worthless, who had still managed to stop for a dying stranger in a blizzard, who sat in a cave and built a fire for someone she didn't know and walked away before dawn because she couldn't afford to be found, who asked once an evening whether someone was coming back. He was definitely coming back. He'd figure out what that meant later. 2 days before they planned to announce the public hearing, things moved faster than Cord had wanted. Harlan Voss sent 4 men to the Apache camp, not himself. He was too smart for that. They arrived in the morning while Cord was in town. They had a piece of paper that Pickett had apparently signed, a removal order, citing the camp as unlawfully established within town limits. Dessa read the paper. She folded it, she handed it back. She said, "Tell Sheriff Pickett he can deliver his papers himself." One of the men looked at her. At the camp, at the women and the few men standing at the perimeter, doing his calculations. "Ma'am," he said, "this is official. It's paper with a stamp on it," Dessa said. "Come back with the sheriff." They left. Dessa sent a rider to find Cord immediately. By the time he got there, the men were long gone. But the message they'd left was very clear. Harlan was moving. Not content to wait for them to act first, he was applying pressure from every direction, making the camp untenable. Nizzoni told Cord this with the steady, controlled calm she'd developed for delivering bad news, no wasted emotion. Just the facts and then the look that asked. "What do we do?" "We move first," Cord said. "The hearing, yes. Tomorrow." She blinked. "Tomorrow. We can't wait another 2 days. He'll find another angle. We go tomorrow morning." She thought about this for about 4 seconds. "All right. Cutter needs to be there. He'll be there. Dessa. I'll be there." Dessa said from the fire without looking up. Cord looked at both of them. At Cutter, across the camp who'd heard everything, and was already setting his jaw into the expression of a man who has decided. At Dessa, who had apparently decided before anyone asked. "You should know," he said. "Harlan is going to try to stop this. Between tonight and tomorrow morning, he might make a move." "Let him," Nizzoni said. 2 words. Matter of fact, completely without bluster. He believed her. He rode back to Rimrock Flats for the last time that night, with the cold coming down hard off the mesa and the stars very bright above the Red Rock country and his arm, aching in a way he was choosing not to pay attention to. He went to the sheriff's office. Pickett was still there, late, the lamp on low, paper on the desk. Cord closed the door behind him. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Public hearing in the square. Witnesses. Documentation. Everything." Pickett looked up at him. In the low lamplight, his face looked older than 45. Looked like a man who had lived 2 lives simultaneously for too long, and was running out of room for both of them. "He'll be there," Pickett said. "Yes. He'll have men, yes. And you're telling me in advance because you're the law in Rimrock Flats," Cord said. "And whatever Harlan Voss has over you, it is not bigger than 5 people who died in a fire while you looked the other way." He paused. "I'm not asking you to be brave tomorrow. I'm asking you to remember what it felt like before you weren't." Pickett stared at him, said nothing. Cord put his hand on the door. "I'll be in touch, Sheriff." He walked out into the cold New Mexico night and did not look back. Tomorrow. Everything that had been building for 5 years, for 20 years, for the long, careful years of Amos Aldridge's generosity, Red Ribbon, and Thomas's sleepy questions, and Nizzoni's 20 years of silence, was going to come to its reckoning. In a public square in Rimrock Flats. In front of everyone, Ann Cord Dillard, former United States Marshal, currently nobody in particular, was going to make very sure that this time the right people were standing when it was over. He went back to Mrs. Callister's. He didn't sleep, but then again, he hadn't expected to. The morning came in cold and flat and certain. No wind, no clouds. Just the hard blue sky of New Mexico territory in November, sitting over Rimrock Flats, like a witness that had been waiting a long time for this particular day. Cord was up before dawn. His body understood that some mornings were different from other mornings, and this one was as different as they came. He checked his arm. Still wrong. Still not what it should be. He wrapped it again. Tighter. Told himself it would do. He went downstairs. Mrs. Callister was already in the kitchen. She looked at him when he came in and set a cup of coffee on the table without saying anything, which was more than she'd done for him most mornings. He sat down and drank it, and she stood at the window and looked out at the street. "People are already moving," she said. "Word got around." Rimrock Flats is a small town, she paused. Cord Dillard posting notices on 3 buildings at midnight tends to get noticed. He'd done that around 1 in the morning. Simple notices, public hearing, Aldridge Matter, Rimrock Flats Square, 8 o'clock morning, all welcome. He'd nailed them to the dry goods store, the church, the saloon. Places people went first thing. "You think he'll come," Mrs. Callister said. "Not a question." "Harlan Voss doesn't hide," Cord said. "That's not his way. His way is to show up and make you feel like you made a mistake." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew the Aldridge family," she said. "Eleanor Aldridge used to trade quilts for flour here. She had the steadiest hands I ever saw." A pause. "Clara had her hands." Cord looked at her. "Just saying," Mrs. Callister said, and went back to her stove. He finished his coffee, went out into the cold morning, and went to meet what was coming. By 7 o'clock, Rimrock Flats was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. Not loud, not festive, the wrong kind of awake, the kind where people come out of their houses and stand in doorways and look at each other and don't quite know what to say. Because something is happening that doesn't have a name yet, but that everyone can feel in the back of their teeth. Cord set up in the square, which wasn't much of a square, just the open space where the main street widened before the church. But it was central, and it was visible from every direction, which was the point. He'd brought a wooden crate to stand on, so people could see, so voices could carry. Dessa arrived with Nizoni and 3 other women from the camp. They came on foot, moving quietly through the early crowd that was beginning to gather. People parted for them, not with hostility, with the uncertain respect you give people when you suspect they're about to say something. "You've been sewing?" hoping someone would say for a long time. Nizoni caught his eye across the square. She looked present, completely present. No flinching, no looking away. Like every careful, watchful, survival-honed skill she'd developed over 20 years had been redirected. Not toward enduring, toward this. He nodded. She nodded back. 10 minutes later, Cutter Briggs arrived 10 minutes store and walked into the square with the walk of a man, approaching something he's been dreading, and is relieved is finally here. By 7:30, the square had 40 people in it. By 7:45, it had twice that. They kept coming. Ranchers from outside town, men from the mill, women who had known Eleanor Aldridge, or bought flour from Amos, or simply lived long enough in Rimrock Flats to know that something had been wrong here for a very long time without ever having a clear target for that feeling. They came because the notices said Aldridge Matter. And every person in Rimrock Flats had some version of a question about the Aldridge Matter that they'd been told not to ask. Cord stepped up onto the crate at 8 o'clock. He didn't wait. Waiting would have been a mistake. Every minute you wait at the beginning of something like this is a minute for doubt to get its boots on. "My name is Cord Dillard," he said, loud enough for the edges of the crowd. Not shouting. Projecting 10 years of standing before juries and witnesses had given him that. "I was a United States Marshal for 10 years operating out of Albuquerque. I resigned that position 2 years ago. I'm not here in any official capacity." He paused. "Let that settle. I'm here because 5 people died in Rimrock Flats 5 years ago, and the man responsible has been standing in this town ever since. And no one has said his name out loud. Dead quiet." You could hear the cold air moving between buildings. "The Aldridge family," Cord said. "Amos, Eleanor, their son Thomas, who was 4 years old, their daughter Clara, who was 7, a pause on those names, and one ranch hand who worked for them, a man named Pete Sully, who happened to be sleeping in the barn that night. 5 people. In a fire that was ruled accidental in 4 days by a sheriff who arrived at that scene first and found evidence that was not consistent with an accident. He heard the crowd shift, the sound of people turning to look at each other, and then turning forward again. "I have documentation," Cord said. "I have physical evidence. I have testimony. And I have 2 witnesses who were present the night that fire was set." A pause. "I'm going to present all of that to you today, and then you can make your own judgment." He stepped down from the crate, and then Harlan Voss walked into the square. He came from the north end. Of course he did. Harlan always came from the direction that gave him the most room, 3 men behind him, not with guns drawn. That would have been too obvious. But with their hands in positions that made clear where the guns were. Harlan himself looked like he always looked. Put together, measured, the kind of man who ironed his shirt on days when he planned to destroy things. He walked through the crowd, and people moved for him, not because they wanted to, because 20 years of habit is a powerful thing. He stopped at the edge of the open space in front of the crate, looked at Cord. "Dillard," he said, pleasantly. Like they'd bumped into each other at the store. "Voss," Cord said. "This is quite a gathering." Harlan looked around the square with the proprietary interest of a man surveying his own property. "I didn't realize we were having a community event. Now you know. I don't recall being invited." "All welcome," Cord said. "It was on the notices." Harlan smiled. The same smile from the yard days ago, the one that already knew something. "Well then," he said, "I suppose I'll stay." And he moved to the side of the square, stood there with his 3 men behind him, and watched, which was worse in some ways than him trying to stop it. Because Harlan being present and calm and slightly amused was its own kind of threat. It was him saying, "Go ahead. I'm not scared of you. Do your worst. I've handled worse." Cord turned back to the crate, stepped up again. He started with the document, not because it was the most dramatic piece of evidence. It wasn't, but because it established the why, the motive. The reason a man would look at a pamphlet of 5 and make the calculation that he made. He explained the Aldridge debt, larger than people knew, growing for years. Amos Aldridge had been patient, generous with extensions and reduced terms. But there is always a limit. And in the final months before the fire, Harlan Voss had reached it. He explained the land deed, what Amos Aldridge had signed, what it meant for the Apache grazing rights, what it meant for Harlan's control of the surrounding territory. He held up the document, the original. He'd taken it from his saddlebag that morning, with the careful attention of a man handling something irreplaceable. "Amos Aldridge sent this to me 5 years ago," Cord said, 3 months before the fire that killed him and his family. "He told me he didn't trust the local courts. He asked me to keep it safe until the right time." He looked out at the crowd. "The right time is now," he heard murmuring, not hostile, absorbing. Harlan said from the side of the square, in a carrying voice, "A piece of paper from a dead man proves nothing." "You're right," Cord said, without looking at him. "That's why there's more." Dessa came forward first, small, square-shouldered, moving through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided and cannot be undecided. She stood at the front, and she spoke in the clear, precise English of a woman who had chosen every word carefully in advance. She told them about Nizoni's mother, about the marriage to Harlan Voss, about what that marriage was and what it was not. She told them about a woman who had come to her in the final weeks of her life, sick with something the doctor called fever, and told her things she had been unable to say, while she believed saying them might harm her daughter. She told them Harlan had known about the land deed before Amos signed it, had pressured Amos to destroy it, had threatened, had maneuvered. She told them that Nizoni's mother had heard 2 horses leave the yard the night of the fire. She told them she had smelled smoke on Harlan's coat when he returned. She told them all of this with hands folded in front of her, and her eyes on the crowd, and her voice completely level throughout. Harlan said, "Hearsay from a dead woman filtered through a grieving friend." Dessa looked at him for the first. And only time she was not grieving, Dessa said. She was afraid. There is a difference, and you would know it. The crowd was very still. Dessa stepped back. Cord called Cutter Briggs. This was the part he'd been least sure about. Not because of the evidence. Cutter's testimony was the most direct and damning thing they had, but because of the man himself. Because Cutter was not a hero. Cutter was someone who had done a terrible thing for a terrible reason and spent 5 years trying to outrun it. Cord had talked to Cutter about this 2 nights ago, sitting at the edge of the camp with the fire between them. They're going to say you're lying, Cord had told him. They're going to say you're trying to reduce your own guilt by pointing at someone else. I know, Cutter had said. What do you say to that? Cutter had been quiet for a long time. I say that a man who's trying to reduce his guilt doesn't ride back to the place where he did the thing. He'd looked at Cord. A man who's trying to reduce his guilt stays in Copper Ridge under a fake name and drinks himself to death. A pause. I'm choosing the other thing. Now Cutter walked to the front of the square, and he told them, all of it. He told them about the night, about the 2 wagons, about what he thought they were doing and what he understood when the barn doors went shut. He told them about the bar going across, about trying to stop it, about the gun in his face. He told them about the sounds. His voice broke exactly once. On Clara's name. He stopped. Reset, going, he said. I ran the next morning. I've been running since. I'm done running, he said. Harlan Voss put a gun to my head and told me I was already guilty. Maybe he was right, but guilty men can still tell the truth. And the truth is what I'm telling you. He stepped back, Harlan said. A confessed accomplice testifying against his employer. A man trying to trade someone else's neck for his own. I'm not trading anything, Cutter said. Still loud enough to carry. I'm not asking for anything. Say what you want about me. The facts don't change. Murmuring in the crowd. Louder this time, Cord stepped up onto the crate. He presented the physical evidence. The kerosene residue recovered from the Aldridge fire site. The pattern of burning consistent with accelerant use, not an overturned lamp. He described what he'd found and where. He described what it meant. He was steady and precise, and used the language of a man who had spent a decade presenting evidence and knew how to make it land. Harlan stayed quiet through this part, which told Cord something. The physical evidence made him more nervous than the testimony. Testimony could be discredited. Physical evidence required a different kind of answer, and then Cord stepped down from the crate and looked at Nizoni. And she walked forward. The square went very quiet, a different kind of quiet than before. The crowd had been attentive throughout. But this was different. This was the silence of a crowd that understands it is about to hear something that matters differently from everything else. Because they knew who she was. Some of them, the ones who'd been here long enough. They knew her as Harlan Voss's Apache girl. The one he kept close. The one who was apparently dangerous now, apparently unstable, according to the stories Harlan had spent a week distributing. And here she was, 20 years old, standing in the open square in front of everyone. No flinching, no looking down, dressed plain, hair back, the rope marks on her wrists still visible, almost healed but not quite, still there. She didn't use the crate. She just stood, and she spoke. Not to the crowd, to Harlan. She turned her head and found him on the side of the square, and she directed every word at him specifically. Like the crowd wasn't there. Like it was just the 2 of them. Like this was a conversation they'd been not having for 20 years, and she had finally decided to have it. I was 15 years old, she said, when you took me out in the wagon that night. I didn't ask where we were going. I'd learned not to ask. Harlan's face did something. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like the recalibration of a man whose carefully arranged world is rearranging itself around him, and he's still in the phase of believing he can manage it. I watched you pour the kerosene, Nizoni said. I watched you lead the Aldridge family to the barn. I heard Mr. Aldridge say he trusted you. I heard Eleanor Aldridge tell her children it would only be a minute, a pause. Only a second. But everyone felt it. I heard Clara ask her father if she could go back to bed. She said it. Very simply, no dramatic inflection, no reaching for effect, just the truth stated as fact, which was more powerful than any performance. I heard the bar go across the doors, she said. I heard what happened after. She looked at Harlan, directly, like she could see through him. Like the man who had made her afraid, every day for 20 years, was now fully visible to her in some new way. You told me afterward that I now knew what happened. To people who had things you needed, she said. I was 15. And I believed you. I believed that. If I said one word, it would happen again. To someone else, to Dessa, to anyone I cared about, her voice stayed steady. Every word I stayed quiet because I was afraid. I've had 5 years to understand that my silence protected no one. That the people I was trying to protect by staying quiet were already in danger. Because you were already dangerous. Because you had always been dangerous. A pause. And silence doesn't stop dangerous men. It just gives them room. She looked at Harlan for one more moment. Then she looked at the crowd. My name is Najoni, she said. I am the daughter of Shievos, who was Apache, and who deserved better than she got. I have lived in Rimrock Flats my entire life, and I have been afraid for most of it. Her chin came up slightly. I'm not afraid today. She stepped back. The square was absolutely silent, and then Harlan Voss moved. He moved fast for a man of 52. Cord had been watching his hands the entire time Najoni spoke. Because a man like Harlan, when he loses control of a situation, doesn't accept it. He finds the lever. He finds the exit. He finds the move that resets things back to the version of the world where he's the one holding all the options. The gun came out from his coat, not aimed at Najoni, aimed at Cord, because Cord was the structure, the one who'd built this. Take out the structure, the rest collapses. That was the calculation. That was the math of a man who had spent decades running the numbers on every situation and always finding the move. There were screams at the edges of the crowd, people moving back. Cord was already moving, left, off the line of the shot, reaching for his own gun with his right hand. The bad arm, the wrong arm, too slow. He knew it before it happened. He was going to be too slow. And then a voice, Harlan. One word, flat. Final. Carrying across the square, the way only a voice can carry when it has nothing left to lose, Harlan Voss stopped. Because the voice came from his right. And when he turned, Sheriff Burl Pickett was standing 6 feet away from him, with a revolver leveled at the center of his chest. Pickett's hands were shaking. That was visible. That was not something Pickett was trying to hide. His hands were shaking, and his face was the color of old ash. And he looked like a man who had gotten out of bed this morning, not knowing he was going to do this, and had done it anyway. Because sometimes you don't know you're going to do the right thing until you're already doing it. Put it down, Pickett said. Harlan stared at him. The two of them stood there, gun on gun. The crowd gone completely still, the whole square holding one collective breath. Burl, Harlan said. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was gone. What was left was the voice underneath that, the one he used when he needed people to understand exactly who he was talking to. Think about what you're doing, I am, Pickett said. First time in 5 years. You have obligations. We have an arrangement. We had an arrangement, Pickett said. I'm ending it. You end it, Harlan said, and everything comes out. Everything. You understand me. Everything you did. I know, Pickett said. Let it come. A pause. The shaking in his hands didn't stop, but he didn't lower the gun. Let all of it come out. I'm done. I'm done hiding in it, and I'm done letting you use it. He took one step forward. Put the gun down, Harlan. Or I swear before every person in this square that I will not miss something in Harlan's face. Something that had never been there before in any of the times Cord had seen him, uncertainty, because Pickett had been the guaranteed variable. The one Harlan owned, the one who would always fold. And Pickett was not folding, the gun lowered. Slowly, Harlan set it in the dirt, his knees didn't buckle. That would have been satisfying, in a different kind of story. He stayed standing, he stayed composed. But he looked, for the first time, like a man in a world that had been rearranged around him without his permission. Cord moved forward, picked up the gun, stepped back. Harlan Voss, Pickett said, still shaking, still not lowering his weapon. I am placing you under arrest for the murders of Amos Aldridge, Eleanor Aldridge, Thomas Aldridge, Clara Aldridge, and Pete Sully. He stopped, swallowed. And for anything else the territorial court decides to add. Harlan's 3 men were very still, looking at each other. doing their own calculations about what they'd been paid to do and what was now actually happening, and whether those two things still matched. They didn't. And all three of them apparently understood it at the same time. They stepped back from Harlan, and Burl Pickett put the irons on Harlan Voss's wrists in the middle of Rimrock Flats Square. In front of everyone, in the silence that was not really silence, in the silence that was made of 80 people breathing, in the silence that had the weight of 5 years and 20 years, and 100 small cowardices, and a few moments of terrible choice, and one morning, when a man stopped his horse instead of riding past. Someone in the crowd started clapping, just one person. Then another. Then it stopped as quickly as it started. Because this wasn't that kind of moment. This wasn't victory. This was something older and quieter than that. This was a town looking at itself clearly for the first time in 5 years, and not entirely liking what it saw. Mrs. Callister was standing at the edge of the square with her arms crossed. Cord caught her eye. She nodded once. He thought about Eleanor Aldridge trading quilts for flour. About Clara with her mother's steady hands. He looked away before he couldn't. The crowd did not erupt. That was the thing that surprised him most. He'd expected noise. The release of years of contained feeling, and there was some of that. Voices starting up at the edges, people moving, a few women crying, but mostly the square was quiet. The way places get quiet when something has been resolved that took a very long time to resolve. When the resolution is so overdue that there's almost more grief in it than satisfaction. Because the grief was always there. The 5 people who died were still dead. The years that Nozomi had lived afraid were still lived. Nothing undid that. Justice doesn't undo things. It just puts a line under them. It just says, here, this is where it stops. Cord stood in the middle of the square and watched Pickett lead Harlan toward the sheriff's office. Watched the crowd slowly begin to move and speak and touch each other's arms in the way people do when they've been through something collectively and need to confirm they're still real. He was aware of Nozomi coming to stand beside him, not touching. Just beside. It's done, she said. This part, he said. What's the next part? Santa Fe. Testimony before the territorial court. Harlan goes to trial with everything we presented today on record. It's a stronger case than most I've seen. She was quiet a moment. And Pickett? He'll be investigated. For what he covered up. What happens after that depends on the court. A pause. He gave us today. That's not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. They stood there for a moment, in the cold morning. In the square that was slowly emptying, as people went back to their ordinary lives, that were not quite the same ordinary lives as before, Dessa came and stood on Nozomi's other side. Said nothing. Just stood there, which was. Cord had come to understand. Dessa's most powerful mode. The machinery of justice moved the way it always did. Slow. Certain. Indifferent to how long it took. Pickett resigned that same afternoon. Handed in his badge without ceremony. Signed a statement. Agreed to full cooperation with everything that followed. Before he left town, he went to the Apache camp east of Rimrock Flats and stood in front of Nozomi, with his hat in his hands and his face, showing every one of his 45 years, and said what he'd done and what he was sorry for. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything. He just put the weight of what he'd done in front of her and let her decide what to do with it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I hope Missouri is good to you, which was not forgiveness. But it was not nothing. The Santa Fe deputies arrived 4 days later to transport Harlan north for trial. The trial lasted 3 days. Cord testified. Cutter testified. Nozomi testified for the last time, in a room with marble floors and tall windows, her voice the same as it had been in the square. Steady, without drama, every word chosen and placed. The jury took 4 hours. Guilty. All counts. Harlan Voss was sentenced to hang. He received the verdict the way he received everything, with that flat composure that had served him for 20 years and served him still, right up until it didn't matter anymore. He died 3 months later, without ceremony. Without last words worth remembering, Cord heard the news by letter, read it once, put it in his coat, rode east to tell Nizoni. She received the news the way she received most things now, with that direct steadiness that was not coldness, was not indifference. Was the composure of someone who had survived something enormous and come out the other side and discovered that they were, in fact, still standing. "All right," she said. Just that which was exactly enough. The land transfer was completed 2 weeks after the trial. The document Amos Aldridge had signed was honored by the territorial court. The grazing rights reverted to the Apache. The property that had been the Voss Ranch was sold at auction, and the proceeds were directed by court order toward restitution to the families of the Aldridge victims. There were cousins. A brother who'd moved east years ago and hadn't known what had happened until it was all already over. He came to Rimrock Flats, stood in the square where the hearing had been. Stood there for a long time looking at a place he'd never been, that had become connected to his family forever. Cord found him there one afternoon. Didn't know who he was at first. They talked for a while. Just two people in a square in a small town before he left. The man said, "Whoever started all this, I'd like to say something to them. I'll pass it on," Cord said. Just that. He paused. "Clara used to call me Uncle George. She couldn't say it right until she was almost 5. She used to say Uncle Gorge." He looked at the square. "I'd forgotten that until last week. 20 years I couldn't let myself remember it, because remembering it meant thinking about how she died." He stopped. "Now I can remember it again. Just the way she said my name. That's all I wanted to say." He left the next morning. Cord went to the camp that afternoon and told Nizoni what the man had said. She was quiet for a long time. "Good," she said finally. "Soft. That's good." Winter came fully to New Mexico territory in December. Cold off the peaks. Ice at the creek edges in the morning. The kind of cold that clarified things. Made everything very exact and still. Cord had been in Rimrock Flats for 6 longer than he'd planned by quite a significant margin. He kept finding reasons to stay, which was not something he generally did. He was, by both nature and habit, a man who kept moving, who didn't put things down in places long enough that picking them up again became complicated. He was aware that this had become complicated. He had a conversation with Dessa about it. Not a conversation he initiated. Dessa appeared next to him one morning while he was at the water trough and said, without preamble, "How long are you planning to stay?" "I've been thinking about Santa Fe," he said. "You have been thinking about something," Dessa said. "It doesn't look like Santa Fe." He said nothing. Dessa looked at him with the full force of 60 years of accurate assessment. "She's learning the language," she said. "Her mother's language. She started in the mornings with the elder women. She sits with them and practices until she gets each word right." A pause. "She's been doing this for 2 weeks. She didn't tell you." "Why not?" "I think she was afraid you'd leave before she'd finished." Dessa tilted her head. "Which tells you something about what matters to her." Cord looked at the water trough, at the cold, clear water, at his own reflection, which was the reflection of a man who had spent 2 years going nowhere in particular and had accidentally arrived somewhere. "Dessa," he said. "Yes. Am I making a mistake?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, not dismissing it, not reassuring him. "She's 20 years old," Dessa said. "She's been through things that most people don't survive intact. She's still becoming who she is." A pause. "Are you asking if she's ready for whatever this is? Or are you asking if you are?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. "Then I'll answer both," Dessa said. "She's ready for someone to stay. Whether she's ready for everything that comes with, that is something she'll have to discover. Same as anyone." She looked at him. "And you've been ready for someone to stay for longer than you've admitted to yourself." She picked up her bucket. "The question is whether you're going to let ready be enough." She went back toward the camp. Cord stood at the water trough for a while longer. Then he went to find Nizoni. She was at the edge of the camp where the land opened up toward the mesa. sitting on a flat rock the way she sometimes did in the early afternoon, looking out at the red rock country in the winter light. He sat down near her, not too close, the distance they'd been maintaining for weeks. The distance that had been getting slowly smaller without either of them formally acknowledging it. Dessa told me about the language lessons, he said. She looked at him, quick, then back at the mesa. She has no sense of privacy. She has excellent sense of priority, he said. Nizoni said nothing, but something in her shoulders shifted. The shift of someone who's been holding something carefully and has decided to hold it slightly less carefully. I wanted to get it right, she said, before I told you. I wanted to be able to say something correctly. A pause. My mother's name means something in our language. It means the one who remains. She told me that when I was very small. I've been practicing how to say it. Cord looked at her. She said the words, slowly. With the care of someone getting something right, that mattered to get right. He didn't know the language. He didn't know if she'd said it correctly. But the way she said it made that irrelevant. The way she said it was the sound of someone reclaiming something that had been taken from them. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, in the way that beginnings sound when they're real. The one who remains, he said. Yes. He looked out at the mesa, at the winter light on the red rock, at the vast, cold, exact sky above all of it. I've been thinking about Santa Fe, he said. I know I keep not going. I know that too. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. Those dark, careful eyes that had been watching and calculating and surviving for 20 years. Except that right now they weren't calculating. Right now they were just looking. What do you want? He asked. Not pressuring, not reaching for anything, just asking. Because she deserved to be asked. Because she'd spent 20 years in a world where what she wanted was not a factor. Because the ability to answer that question honestly, out loud, to another person, was something she was still learning, and he was not going to rush it. She was quiet for a long moment. I want to finish learning the language, she said. I want to stay here through the winter with Dessa. I want to know what spring looks like on this mesa when I'm not afraid. She paused. And I want you to come back when you've gone to Santa Fe and done what you need to do there. Come back, he said. Yes, not stay. You can't stay, she said. Simply. You don't know how to, yet, and I'm still learning how to let someone stay. She looked at the mesa. But you can come back. That's different. That's something both of us know how to do. Cord thought about that. Two people who had both, in different ways, spent years leaving, or being left, or making themselves small enough that leaving didn't require explanation. Come back. That was manageable. That was a thing he could do. All right, he said. She nodded, looking at the mesa again. They sat there for a while in the cold afternoon, not talking, not needing to. The way two people sit when they've said the actual thing and everything else can wait. He left for Santa Fe 2 days later. The land deed needed filing with the territorial court. There was a deposition to give. There were a few things to close that had been open for 3 years. Clean work. The kind that felt different now than it would have before Rimrock Flats, before all of this. He filed the deed, gave the deposition, wrote a full report on the Aldridge case, and left copies with the territorial judge and the Santa Fe marshal's office. He talked to his former colleagues, had a beer, slept in a real hotel for the first time in months. He thought about Rimrock Flats the whole time, not just her. Though that was the center of it, he thought about Dessa, whose certainty about everything was both irritating and deeply reassuring. He thought about Cutter Briggs, who'd ridden back to a place he'd been running from, and said the hardest true thing he'd ever said, and was now somewhere on the other side of it, figuring out what came next. He thought about Pickett on his way to Missouri. He thought about a man named George, who could now remember the way a little girl said his name. He thought about what it meant to stop, because that was what this was. Underneath all of it, the question of whether a man who had spent years moving could stop. Not forever, not in the way of giving something up, in the way of choosing, in the way of saying, This place, these people, this is worth more than the going. He thought he might be ready to find out. He came back to Rimrock Flats on a Thursday in January, cold morning. Ice at the edges of things, the sky, the winter blue that comes at altitude, very clear, very exact, the kind of blue that made everything else look sharper. He rode into the Apache camp from the east. Same direction he always came from now. Dessa was at the fire. She looked up when she heard Decker's hooves, made the small nod that was her version of welcome. "How long this time?" she said. "Don't know," he said. A while, she handed him a cup of something hot without comment. Nizoni came out of one of the structures a few minutes later, stopped when she saw him, and then did the thing she did, the thing he'd come to think of as specific to her. She didn't smile right away. She looked at him first, that direct, assessing look, confirming, making sure he was real, making sure this was actually happening. Then she walked toward him. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would. People say things. I know." He handed Dessa's cup back. "I came back anyway." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked out at the mesa, at the winter light coming low across the red rock. "The elder women taught me something new yesterday," she said. "The word for beginning. What is it?" She said it. Careful, clear. He said it back. Badly, completely incorrectly. The sounds were wrong and probably two of them were entirely fabricated. She looked at him. He looked at her. "That was terrible," she said. "I know. You should practice. I intend to," he said. "I have time." And she smiled, the first full smile, the one that changed everything about her face, the one he'd been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting, since the morning he'd ridden into a yard in Rimrock Flats and heard a sound that stopped him cold. The mesa went gold around them. The cold air was sharp and clean. Somewhere behind them, Dessa was making more tea and pretending not to watch. And it was a beginning, the real kind, the kind that starts quietly, with no audience and no fanfare, and nothing to announce it except two people standing in the morning light deciding, without saying so, that this is where they'll start, the kind that lasts.